This is part 2 of the chapter 25 lesson. We're going to be looking at the Latin American economies after independence. So, first off, we got to start with kind of looking at the responses on the part of Spain and Portugal. Obviously, Spain and Portugal aren't very happy to lose their colonies. Most of the independence movements that take place happen during the period of Napoleonic rule in Europe. So Europe is very unstable. Spain and Portugal really don't have the political power to keep their colonies. But once Napoleon is driven out and Spain and Portugal regain control, and strengthen their countries back home, they are going to attempt to take back colonies in the Americas. However, the United States will come to the aid of Latin America at this point by issuing the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically says if you try to recolonize, we will consider that a threat, and the implication there is that the United States will go to war with you if you try to take back a colony that has achieved independence. Britain actually supports this. Now, why would Britain support this? Largely because if Spain and Portugal are weakened, or if their empire has been dismantled, Britain's really happy about that, because Britain is now on its way to becoming the world's supreme empire, moving into the mid to late 19th century. Britain does not want Spain and Portugal to regain power, and the Monroe Doctrine really helps to check the power of Britain's rivals. So Britain will come in and fill in the trade gap in Latin America. It will establish strong trading relationships with many Latin American states like Argentina, Peru, Chile, and Brazil. So, what are they trading? Well, in Argentina, you've got a large beef industry. A lot of cattle farms in Argentina. In Chile, minerals and grains. In Peru, one of their main products is guano, or bird droppings, which are used in fertilizer. What you start to see as a result of these goods is that after 1850 there is a bit of an economic surge, but this economic surge is once again primarily in raw materials. Because they do not have a diversified economy, they're still going to remain vulnerable to European demand. If Europe finds a better fertilizer than guano, then Peru's economy is going to be shot. Right? So this is not exactly ideal, even though in the latter half of the 19th century Latin America is doing fairly well. Middle class reformers will try to change some of this. They'll try to industrialize, much like the United States did, but they get a lot of pushback. They get pushback by, interestingly enough, both the peasants and the landowning elite. Both of these groups have their lives totally centered around the land, and they're not willing to see change. They don't want that status quo disrupted, even if it would be good for the economy in the long term. There will be an economic resurgence, as I mentioned, after 1850. Some of this is due to a theory called positivism. This is a theory created by Auguste Comte. He stresses observation and scientific approaches to solving society's problems. This is kind of what we talked about with the Enlightenment, and of course I use the example of how you write your essays. You have a thesis, you have evidence, you try to analyze that evidence to prove your thesis. It's the same type of thing, just kind of repackaged with a new name, using the scientific method to come up with ways to solve the problems of the economy. As a result of positivism, one of the conclusions that they will come to will be that industrialization needs to happen in Latin America, Latin American leaders will seek to change and to try to keep up with the changing economic world. Some politicians will seek progress in this. But once again, you've got the property owners that are going to be very upset about this. Also during this time period, you're going to start to see a lot of immigration, especially into Argentina and Brazil. In Argentina, immigrants are going to be working on in Argentina they're going to be working on cattle ranches, and in Brazil they're going to be working on coffee plantations called fazendas. A lot of times these immigrants will actually come over as indentured servants, meaning they will work for a period of time with no pay, and then they will be given property after that. A lot of times indentured servants come, and they do it that way because they're very poor back in Europe. They don't have money for the journey, so they come, they work off their passage, and then they get to start afresh in the new world after that period of time is over. But because there is still a demand for labor in Argentina and Brazil, those two countries will attract a lot of immigrants to fill that labor force. In Mexico, you've got a lot of instability. And again, a lot of this instability goes back to Mexico's poverty, lack of equally distributed wealth, a flawed constitution, lack of education. All of this is contributing to it. Liberals do come into power in the 1820s and 30s and try to seek reforms. One of the reforms that they actually try to do is they want to bring in settlers to their one of the northern held territories or regions of Texas. The state of Texas, what is today Texas, used to be part of Mexico. Liberals actually invited American settlers to come in and to basically develop Texas. They wanted it to be a land of farms and settlement. And a lot of American farmers took Mexico up on that offer, came in, usually brought in slaves, and they set up large plantations in Texas. The problem was started in the mid 1830s when General Antonio Santa Anna came to power. He was much more of a conservative. He was opposed to a lot of the liberal reforms, and he did a lot of things that angered the American settlers living in Mexican Texas. For instance, he abolished slavery. He said he wasn't going to allow slaves in that region. He gave more power to the Catholic Church. American settlers didn't like that. They decided that they would lead a revolution and they would declare independence. A lot of the Americans living in Texas are fueled by this idea of manifest destiny, which basically means that it is our God-given responsibility to expand westward as Americans. In the United States, this whole idea of manifest destiny was promoted, that it was the United States' destiny to reach from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And so the American settlers living there thought, well, we're just kind of furthering manifest destiny by overthrowing the Mexican government in Texas, and we'll take over Texas. There actually was a bit of a lag time between when Texas successfully declared independence and when it was annexed by the United States. For about 9 years, Texas was its own nation until it became part of the United States. At that point, when Texas became part of the United States, the border dispute that had kind of been simmering for years just erupted. It couldn't settle the border of Texas. Mexico wanted the border to be more to the north at the Nueces River, which basically would have made for a smaller Texas. The United States, the American settlers there, said no, our border needs to be at the Rio Grande, which gives us a larger Texas, that's the more southern border. Fought over this border, the United States won the Mexican-American War and signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. As the victors, the United States acquired half of Mexico's territory. That is today the states of California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah. That made up about half of Mexico at the time. So the size of Mexico after 1846 is cut in half, and as you can imagine, that's obviously going to lead to some bitterness between the two nations, but Mexico is largely going to have to kind of go back to working on focusing on its own internal tensions, and so there will be peace between the two nations after that for the most part. Benito Juarez will be the next reformer to come to power, seeking liberal reforms. The La Reforma movement will take place alongside of that. This is a liberal revolt that is largely going to try to reduce the military and to take away power from the Catholic Church. Essentially, what a lot of the peasants want is to see land taken away from the Catholic Church and redistributed among the peasants. As I think I mentioned before, the Catholic Church owns most of the land in Mexico, and the peasants clearly want to have a piece of that. The conservatives get very defensive about this Reforma movement. They don't like the changes. Remember when we did our liberal conservative activity a few classes ago, conservatives generally like the status quo. They are comfortable with the power structure of the elites on top. And so conservatives in Mexico are saying, what can we do to keep the status quo? Well, one option that they come up with is, let's invite the Europeans back. Well, we don't want to have Spain come back and take us over. What about the French? The conservatives actually asked the French to send them a monarch. And the French urged the Austrian Duke Maximilian von Habsburg. He was convinced to come over and take the throne in Mexico. This was a very, very short-lived government. Maximilian was overthrown and his generals were captured and executed by Juarez. Juarez will return to power. He will still be seen as a champion for liberalism, for nationalism, as a champion for the poor, but in reality he will become increasingly autocratic. And so you still don't see in Mexico, as I said, these Enlightenment ideals, these egalitarian ideals are really not characterizing the post-colonial governments in Mexico like they are in other places in Europe and the United States. In Argentina, you're going to continue to see clashes between the centralists and the federalists. I talked about that in the last video. The federalists, remember, want to see control broken up. They want to see regional control. Manuel de Rosas favors the ranchers. He will come to power in the mid-19th century, but he will be very brutal towards his opponents. You don't see a lot of tolerance in most of these Latin American governments. You don't see a lot of religious tolerance. You don't see a lot of tolerance for opposition. These are definitely not places where the freedom of speech and the freedom of petition and all of those First Amendment rights that are so enshrined in the United States government, they are not really translating to most of these Latin American governments at the time. Rosas will be driven from power in 1852, and a new constitution will be issued under Juan Bautista Alberti. The Argentine Republic will be set up in 1862, and this is basically a new unified nation of Argentina. Domingo Sarmiento will become the president. He will actually bring the nation into a period of prosperity and some political stability. One of the key ways he does this is by seeking in foreign investments. He gets a lot of American businessmen from the United States to come down to Argentina to set up businesses there. This will help local populations by providing jobs, which puts money in their pockets, which fuels the local economy. Now, it's not ideal. Ideally, you want to have your own homegrown companies. You want to have your own Argentinians building their own companies, because then the profit's going back into Argentina. With foreign investment, a lot of the profit from those companies is going back to the United States. But it is still helping to provide jobs and to provide a stable economy, at least for a time. Brazil is going to be the next economy to talk about. Brazil and Argentina are going to be two of the stronger economies in Latin America, and that can still be said to be true today. Brazil has a much smoother transition to nationhood than other countries in Latin America. The social structure remains pretty much intact. Dom Pedro I, remember he was the son of King Dom João. Dom Pedro I was the guy that declared independence. Dom Pedro II will be his son. He actually becomes emperor very early on, when he's very young. Once he becomes old enough to actually take power, he will rule fairly effectively in Brazil. Coffee will be the major economic resource. You will have throughout Brazil large coffee estates called fazendas. Foreign companies will invest in coffee and fuel the development there. We'll also see by the end of the 19th century a transition from slavery to a dependence on immigrant labor. Now, Brazil is actually going to be the last place to outlaw slavery, and after that happens, they will rely heavily on indentured servants coming in from Europe to staff a lot of these coffee estates. Indentured servants and immigrants and a class called golondrinas, which we'll talk about in the next video. All of these groups will be coming in and helping to fuel the coffee economy in Brazil. There will be some modernization and industrialization that takes place. However, a lot of resistance. There's a lot of resistance to this. It will actually lead to a bloodless coup or a bloodless overthrow of Dom Pedro II. And you'll see after that point the establishment of the Brazilian Republic. During this period, there's a lot of peasant unrest. Most of this peasant unrest is due to the spread of industrialization. The peasants don't like the idea of factories and cities. That's impeding on their way of life, and that makes them uncomfortable. This will lead to the rise of the Canudos, which is a guerrilla movement that will largely oppose the spread of industrialization. I'm going to end the section on economy here, and we'll have one more PowerPoint that will one more presentation that will deal with society.